Hi, this is Hiki with the Lost Samba podcast, bringing you the best of Brazilian music in the English language online. This week, we're going to speak about what's considered the biggest show on earth, namely the Carnival Parade of Rio de Janeiro. As this is a very vast subject, we have decided to do this in 2, perhaps even 3 episodes. And we hope you like it. Carnival is a very ancient festival. It traces its origins back to, of all places, Babylon, in the festival of Akitu, which was a festival of renewal. It was a new year. It was a festival to welcome the spring. And one of its main features was the ritual humiliation of the king. The idea was to reverse societal roles. And after this humiliation, there'll be parades through the streets, and there'll be music and gods on carts. In some ancient societies, there was even the case of getting prisoners condemned to death to play the role of a king during 4 or 5 days. They'll dress his clothes, they'll put on his crown, they'll eat the same food that you'd normally eat, they'll give orders, and even have his women for those 5 days. Obviously, after the king would come back, these guys would be killed, and life would continue as always, but renewed. This festival made its way to Europe via the Roman Empire, and it must have been very popular there because it survived the Roman Empire. And when the medieval days came and the church had taken over life or social life, it was incorporated, as so many other pagan traditions, into the Catholic liturgy. Or liturgy, I don't know how to pronounce it. And it appeared, or it was tucked in the long weekend preceding the Lent fast. It's supposed to mirror the fast that Christ did before he was crucified. People weren't supposed to eat for 40 days. It became more lenient. People started eating fish, and then instead of being like 40 days, it became a week, then 1 day. But what interests us is the period before it, which is a period of festivities, of where people would indulge themselves in drink and in a lot of meat, because they weren't going to eat all that time. And meat in Latin is called carne, or carne in Portuguese, hence the word carnival. As you would expect, who brought this festival to Brazil was the Catholic Church. In its official way, it was instituted as a national religious holiday. But the Portuguese colonizers also brought with them a non-Catholic or pagan tradition, which was in Portugal too, synchronized with the Catholic festival, which is a festival of Entrudo. It still exists in rural areas. They construct this huge doll, which they set fire to. They mess around with people. I would imagine that during the medieval times, this was a big reversal to the order, because this was not Catholic and it was permitted during those 4 days. And you know, joining with the licentiousness of eating meat and drinking, it was something that resembled the current day carnival in a way, right? The music was completely different. In Brazil, the Brazilian version of the Entrudo brought by the colonizers took another kind of aspect, right? The slaves would put like powder on their face, white powder. They'll take to the streets, they'll dance, they'll do music, and they'll throw some scented water on other people. They'll smother each other with a paste, you know, done with flour and eggs, and it was great fun. And the slave owners also did that in their houses, and it was quite innocent. And for those 4 days, there was this reversal of the order. The slaves would use their masters' clothes, but gradually it became a bit nasty, because some slave owners, they wouldn't like their neighbor, or they wouldn't like a competitor, and they'll call their slaves, say, hey, get this water here, which wasn't water, it was urine, and they'll throw this on a competitor or on the enemy. They mixed other things, they'll throw eggs, and it became like very rowdy, and obviously this would cause fights and everything. And in Rio, it was forbidden, but at least until the beginning of the 1980s, this continued in Recife. I witnessed it. I went to Recife in 79, so that's still the 70s. And they'd have this thing called the Mela Mela. Apparently it's also, you have it in Peru also, and in other Latin American countries, where people go to the streets. They go with these huge injections, right? It's like something at least 1.5 meters long, full of water, and they'll squirt this on people who were passing by. They'd also take a lot of powder and they throw it on people, and they'd also have paste, and they would kind of smother each other. It was a lot of fun. Like, you'd see cars that had taken out their doors, and guys would, like, with a bucket of water, and whoever they saw, they threw water on them, and the guys on the street would squirt this water back, and it was a civil war, but of water and of joyness. At night, there'd be the frevo bands, and people would smother you, you'd smother people. And my hosts, the people who were staying, said, be careful, because people put some stinky stuff in the water. With me, this never happened, and it was a lot of fun. I can imagine that in the colonial days, it was also a lot of fun, but it ended up being forbidden. The first historical records of the Entrudo, they date back to the 17th century, the 1600s, so it's stayed in Brazil for quite a long time. Anyway, now we're talking about the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, which is when the carnival started to look more as it does nowadays. And the elites had already left the Entrudo, and they now, during the carnival time, they still celebrated it, but they celebrated it in private balls, in clubs, usually very expensive clubs. So there was no popular participation there. Black people were not allowed in, not only because they didn't have the money, but also because of racial prejudice. What they also did was they tried to imitate European carnival, especially the carnival from Paris, where they started to make these parades with cars. So they'd decorate cars, they'd put on music in some of them, and they'd pass by making fun of people, and people went to the streets to see these cars. Really, in those days, there wasn't much to do, so anything different people went to watch. People from poorer neighborhoods, they felt left out, obviously, and so they came out with their own version of the carnival, which were basically two, right? The cordões, which kind of stuck with a bit of the Entrudo stuff. They were very rowdy. They messed around with people. A cordão could be called is a kind of a chain. One person grabs the waist of the person in front of them, and you kind of make a human snake, if you will, and that goes around the crowd, and it does some curves and goes round and everything, and it can be a lot of fun. And there were also the ranchos, which was a more civilized, if you will, version of the cordão, where people wanted distance of that rowdy thing. So there were more organized parades, which already showed some things that the escolas de samba, which are the carnival schools, but I'll call them escolas not to confuse people, because when you say school, you especially for English-speaking people, the idea of primary school or a school where you go to learn things. So let's call them escolas, right? And we'll see why they're called escolas later on. There was a commission that opened the parade, which were usually the directors of the rancho, usually formally dressed. And then there was the porta-bandeira and the mestre-sala, which is a porta-bandeira is a woman who takes the flag of the association. And the mestre-sala is the guy who dances around or escorts, if you will. And this is present these two elements are present until nowadays in the escolas de samba. And there's also they also started organizing these parades by themes. Some of them, they had what you call alas. So there was one, so let's imagine the parade was about Rio, right? So one part of the group or the rancho would dress up as the sea, the other one would dress up as the mountain, and the other one would dress up as the sun. So it was divided in different subsections, and these are called alas that also until these days exist. These were the embryos of the escolas de samba. The music of the rancho until today, there's what you call the marcha rancho, which is sounds a bit like a military march, right? March. And the cordões, they were more chaotic, and they probably use more Afro things, but nothing to do with present-day samba. We talked about the carnival and the origins of the party and the festivals and everything, but what we didn't talk about is the filling of the sandwich, which is its rhythm, its music, the samba. Now, we have a podcast about samba. The link is up here, where we discuss in depth where samba comes from. But we're going to add some informations to that and recall it. If you don't have the patience to watch it, you can at least see what's here. Samba obviously comes from Africa. You don't hear that rhythm with the natives, nor with the Portuguese, which are the other two races or cultures that make the Brazilian one. It obviously comes from Africa. Now, one thing that's important to know and what makes it unique in Brazil, when the masters bought their slaves, they made a point in separating them from their families and from other people of their ethnicities. The reason for this is, I think, obvious. They didn't want people to be too close because that would help them revolt, or that would help them escape because they understood each other and they would protect each other. So in the farms, you had this huge number of people who didn't speak the same language, and the only thing they had in common was their situation, right, of being enslaved people. In this context, drumming, the drums and the rhythms became central to their social life. They'll meet each other, they'll talk to each other, relate to each other, and it was a kind of a religious thing. The guy would be playing a drum, people would sing, and they would dance to it. In some places, they would kind of get into trance where they would receive deities and everything. And this became widespread in the farms of Brazil. The Yoruba people, the people who come from Nigeria, they kind of became the dominant people. There were many ethnicities who came to Brazil. They were the main one. And they had a tradition where an elder would be like the big guy in these circles, right? And he would call in initiates or women who he fancied into the dance. And the way he called them in was by contacting his navel to the navel of the guest. The reason that they put navel to navel, there was this navel contact, is that they believed that the vital energy was concentrated there. So the vital energy of the senior participant would go to the more junior one, and he'd receive all the good vibes or the good spirits. In Brazil, navel is umbigo, so this until this day the dance of the umbigada. But in Yoruba, the navel is called Samba. So it's easy to figure out that there was a circle of people, a roda de Samba, of Samba. This became very popular in the farms, and when slavery was abolished, this was in the 1800s, many slaves, well, all of them became free. They went to the main cities, and they continued with these rodas de Samba or de Samba. But the white people, who they hardly touched each other in their dances. It was like very formal, and you had to be invited, and it was like only for the elites. So these parties where people put their navel on another person's navel and dance together, they were considered too sensuous, right? And in a certain way, subversive. The rodas de Samba or the rodas de Samba became prohibited, right? Because it attempted against the morality of the society, and it was done by black people who, in their view, were dangerous and uncivilized. If there was a roda de Samba, the police would go there, or military, or the guys who worked for the big farmers, to finish it. One of the places where these rodas were most popular is the region of the Recôncavo Baiano. That's the area around Salvador. And there was a huge migration. People couldn't take it anymore. In Rio, it wasn't free from persecution, but it was more civilized and it was probably less violent. But the persecution continued. Now, there's a pivotal figure called Tia Ciata. Again, she's present in my other podcast about Samba. She was a famous cook. She was a Afro priestess. She was a healer. And she, for several reasons that I explained in the other podcast, her house became a center for Samba. It was one of the few places that the police didn't persecute, or that it was okay to do Samba. This was in a place called the Praça 11. This was known as the neighborhood of the free slaves, but at the end of the 19th century, the late 1800s, that place, or Brazil, started to receive a lot of refugees from Europe, or lots of immigration from Europe, mainly Spanish and Italian anarchists, because they had to run away because of political persecution, and also Jews. So the area of the Praça 11 became a very effervescent place in terms of culture, where cultures mix, where people with very advanced and cosmopolitan ideas mixed with freed slaves. It was in Tia Ciata's house that became like the embassy of Samba, or the main cultural center of Samba, that a lot of talents appeared, like Donga, João da Baiana, Pixinguinha. It was there where the first recorded samba in Brazil was written, Pelo Telefone, that, by the way, talks about corruption schemes. Pelo Telefone, for it to be recorded and for it to be accepted by the recording companies at the time, it had to be de-Africanized. So the drums were less present, and they introduced wind instruments such as the saxophone, flutes. They also introduced the guitar. So it became less like its origins from the Umbanda, basically, or from the roda de samba, and it became whiter. You find echoes of this even in the bossa nova, that was a whitening of samba. And you find this in the Carnival of Bahia, and you find this in several moments of Brazilian music. This kind of, okay, let's take the African, and even in rock and roll, let's take the African element out of this and it will sell better. Nonetheless, Pelo Telefone was a massive success. The record sold very well. You know, it was a new technology. People had it in its house. You'd go to parties, or you'd go to a bar, and Pelo Telefone was playing. And because record players were being sold all over the country, it became a national hit. So that's where the samba became the most important Brazilian rhythm in its pantheon of rhythms.
O chefe da polícia pelo telefone mandou me avisar que na Carioca tem uma roleta para se jogar. O chefe da polícia pelo telefone mandou me avisar.
Thank you for watching this podcast. As I said in the beginning, it's a very vast subject, so it doesn't fit into one podcast. It would fit, but it would take like an hour or 2 hours. So as I said, we're going to divide it into 3 episodes. This was the first one. The next one is about how samba became world famous, how it became like the greatest show on earth, how it really reached its current format. And to finalize this podcast, I would like to thank Fabio Freitas, who I don't know personally. I've never met, never even sent an email to him, but he has a brilliant podcast about the history of samba, and without it, I would never have had the informations that I have. I'm going to leave the link below in the explanations of this podcast. And if you're curious to really go into detail, I recommend watching his podcast. And it's in Portuguese, but I guess with YouTube's technology, you can have subtitles in English or in whichever language you prefer. I hope to see you in the next podcast, and I wish you a great week. Aquele abraço, tudo de bom.